Hey everyone, welcome to Dirk Island. This is the weekend show where we talk about documentaries that we've watched. My name's Michael Durkheimer.
I'm Alec Durkheimer.
And this week we're talking about two different documentaries covering the same subject. Very controversial documentaries, both on the FYRE Festival. One of them done by Netflix called FYRE, The Greatest Party That Never Happened, and the other on Hulu called FYRE Fraud. And I actually think both of those names are pretty good for each different documentary, and we can discuss why as we go on. Initial thing, yes, we're wearing sunglasses. It's because my eye is a bit swollen.
I'm wearing them in solidarity.
Yeah, and I guess since we're talking about the FYRE Festival documentaries and it's all like fake beach themed, then this kind of works with that.
Yeah, it's appropriate.
As we start, what were your initial impressions? And then you got to cover both now of the FYRE and the FYRE Fraud documentaries.
My initial impressions, I liked both. I thought fascinating story of fraud that kind of has this feeling of relevance to our generation, the millennial generation, the social media generation, talking about, fear of missing out and kind of also this startup and social media and lifestyle of fake it till you make it. So
yeah.
It was pretty, and I mean, just ends in such a mess. So it was wildly interesting. I didn't know much about the story, so I was like, holy shit, I cannot believe this fraud happened.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even before these came out, I really wanted to see them because when the FYRE Festival failed, I was like one of those people reading all the news. Like, I don't go to music festivals. Like, I was not going to the FYRE Festival. I was not interested. I didn't hear about it until it was already a failure, but it was such a fascinating failure and it's such a fascinating story, obviously, to have two different documentaries made, and for each one made for slightly different purposes. And I think when you watch as many documentaries as we do, you see that there are slightly different purposes at play here, and they're not even the only takes on the FYRE Festival that one could have. But yes, the initial impression is it really does give you more of a sense of like this festival, this Coachella, this like Yacht Week. It's like Coachella and like the Yacht Week type thing, like combined into one,
Yep.
This thing that you see people doing on social media where they're going out and they're, in some sort of crazy location, wearing crazy outfits, and also like doing maybe a music festival or whatever, but this fantasy of this, the ridiculous fantasies of both that are kind of realities of both, cooked up into one ultra, ridiculous fantasy that is so ridiculous that it can't even really happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because the event and the fakeness behind it itself is like a manifestation for the use of social media.
Yeah.
And seeing people living, you look at someone's Instagram feed and they're always cooking the most organic, awesome meal, like every time they go to the farmer's market, yet they have time for their podcast. They're always, yet they're effortlessly chilling on the beach. Like, it's just, the whole event itself is sort of like the Instagram influencer. Like, it's a metaphor for that whole kind of part of social media.
Yeah, and I also think that's also an interesting part about when you're watching a documentary that at the end of the day is about like a big failure or a big fraud, whichever one documentary is more in one camp and another documentary is in another camp. But when you're watching something about this, usually you have to look at it as a bit of a tragedy almost. And this one, because of the genre and because it's so the goal is so insane, or not insane as in like it's a crazy person thing, but it's insane as like it's this Instagram orgy of ridiculousness. You get to almost like be a little bit like, I don't really care so much that people were defrauded in this. Like, I care, but it's hilarious, and there's a sense of guilty comedy to the whole fact that this went down so horribly.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely shitty that he kind of took people's money, basically defrauded them of their money. Some people showed up to a very remote island and probably had one of the shittiest like 48 hours of expected vacation, and then it turns from the best event you're going to have all year to the worst nightmare travel scenario.
Yeah.
But then you also learn, these are kids who are in their 20s mostly, who are pretty, would wear sunglasses inside, who are forking up to like, it's not just a $2,000 like entry level ticket package, whatever. It's going up to $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 to live on some, yacht or in some cabana to go to a music festival and just live that Instagram life. So that kind of counterbalances the feeling too bad for the victims, and the different documentaries lean into that differently.
It's got that dark comedy, even though it's a nonfiction piece. It's got that dark comedy of when the kids show up and they're like, I thought I was going to hang out with Instagram models, but instead they've built like FEMA refugee camp tents for us. And because they didn't even build them in time, it's all soaking wet. And you see them show up and there's still people who are like, let's drink. It's like, okay, I don't know if
they were still
I can't. It's very hard to feel bad about this. It's between feeling bad and like breaking out into laughter at how ridiculous it is. You're often just involuntarily falling into the dark comedy aspect of it, which makes it pretty watchable.
Yeah.
Okay. So if this documentary was, often we ask, why does this documentary matter? What's the purpose for it being? And we should ask this about both documentaries because they say a bit different things. So what's the reason that these were both made, and what's the reason maybe that two were made on this story? What would you say to that?
I mean, it just kind of, I think... It's an incredible story of fraud and how fraud can be perpetrated through social media. And what's kind of great about it is it's one story that's very interesting about fraud, but both of them seem to kind of speak to a part of the culture, and that it's very in the zeitgeist for, how we interact with social media and that kind of ethos of the cult of personality around businesses, and the fraud behind that. So that's what to me makes it important, is it's like a fascinating story of fraud that was perpetrated on a pretty substantial level. A lot of money and a lot of people were expecting to go to a music festival that never happened, but it like throughout the whole thing kind of is a little bit of a reflection on the time we're in and the millennial generation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that to me, each one matters differently. Mm-hmm. The Netflix one, so what we should say is the Netflix one was co-produced by Fuck Jerry Media or whatever, Jerry Media. That's like an Instagram account called Fuck Jerry, which a lot of people who want to see like random memes, allegations that like a lot of them are stolen from other people anyway.
Yes.
It's like you could Google that about Fuck Jerry and all of the allegations of stolen
for
jokes,
basically
and
posting other comedians' jokes and not accrediting them.
So they have a bit of controversy around them anyway, aside from this whole thing that they're involved in. But in reality, the Netflix FYRE, the Greatest Party That Never Happened documentary, that paints this picture of an incredible marketing coup in a way, which is that it tells a marketing story in a bit. It tells a story of a guy says he's got Pablo Escobar's old Caribbean island or island in the Bahamas. He's purchased it, and he wants to throw a music festival there with Ja Rule, and they're both in on it. They're both the entrepreneurs. So we say, yeah, you hire us. We'll get a bunch of Instagram models. We'll do all of that. We'll do this pure like Instagram campaign where we're going to pay a bunch of people a bunch of money to put an orange square on their Instagram. So like when you're scrolling through your Instagram feed, you're going to see an orange square. And it's a very catchy thing because a lot of people, and famous people, it paid lots of famous people to do this. And then also create a marketing video that is extremely slick, where they hire basically all of the top models, like all of the top young models, like I don't even, just all that you've ever heard of that are these Instagram, like, huge models. They hire them, bring them out to this random island. They, like, drink and party with, like, Ja Rule and whatever. And they do, like, this thing. It was where they had this one challenge. What was that? Where everyone's, like, still. Like, I forget what that's called.
The mannequin challenge?
Yeah, the mannequin challenge. They do this mannequin challenge with, like, all these super famous Instagram models and all. And it seems like this, like, wild party scene. And it's just, like, such a sensation from a marketing perspective. The problem is, and I think that the big blind spot and guilty piece about the Netflix documentary is that it is connected with the people who created this marketing campaign. They are part of the creators of the documentary too. So it doesn't really put any blame on them, right? And even there's, I believe in this documentary, while you watch both, you kind of forget where you saw one scene versus another. There's like a clip of Ja Rule. Someone's like, is this fraud? Or is it or not fraud? And he's like, I wouldn't call this fraud. I might say, like, false advertising. Because, like, there was this thing where they're like, you're gonna get this villa, and then, like, people show up and it's like a FEMA tent, or like, you got this, and they don't even have them. Like, they're selling things they don't have, which is very much a now startup type story where people think they're allowed to sell things that don't exist and then go figure it out afterwards, which is so, you know, I think some people think that's false advertising, maybe, but at the end of the day, it certainly is false advertising to say we got this Pablo Escobar island. Totally, we're not allowed to say that, and the island was completely shut off. So then they had to go to some other island. There, you know, all this stuff that comes untrue. You know, all these models are it's gonna be this party with, like. The idea that anyone believed that this was, like, the real thing is crazy, but in the end, why did they believe it? Because they made a video saying that's what it was. You know, so I think there's a level where false advertising becomes, it actually is just straight up fraud. Where you're talking about, like, if you're an endorser and you're like, I eat, you know, this shitty junk food every day, and then I compete in the Olympics at, like, 5 p.m. Like, that's not false to me. That's not false advertising. That is, like, just fraud. Like, it's not true. It's like it's like obviously untrue. You're paying someone, and I don't understand why some people can be like, yes, I have this incredible physique and whatever, and if the next, like, random ass infomercial, like, product with, like, a rubber band comes to me, I'm gonna say this is why I have the physique. You know, it's like, that's not true. I don't understand why false advertising is like a lesser thing. Like, it's actually just straight up a lie on people to get money from them. It's hard to see why that's not like easy to understand as fraud, and why, if you are an advertiser, why it's difficult to understand that you should actually be like, wait, if I am helping someone advertise something as, like, a party on an island with these models, with these villas, and, like, it doesn't exist yet, like, how can I actually advertise that? It's pretty obvious to me that that should be not okay and, like, is very morally reprehensible. But you know, I mean, at the end of the day, it was a very successful marketing campaign. I just think that the marketing campaign is completely unethical. And the Netflix documentary doesn't go there. And you kind of think that's because of who's involved in making it. It really, at the end of the day, you're like, but it would have been a great party, right? Like, it's the greatest party that never happened, right? And it's like, actually, it's just like a complete sham, and, like, more people should be think that what they're doing on a daily basis is problematic. But then again, I think maybe where I come out on the, like, what you should be able to endorse and say you're using, like, some X product, I know that the way that Instagram or television or regular advertising works is, like, a lot of people are advertising shit that they have never used, don't have any intention of using, think is crap or whatever, and they'll even say, like, you like me because I'm fit, or, like, you like me because I'm hot, like, you should like this because this made me cool, or, like, at least perfume advertising does, you know, which is kind of like that always. It's just like, just find a really attractive person and, like, pretend that they're wearing and then just put the name of the perfume at the end of it. Like, there's no even, it's, like, so shameless. You're like, it's okay. Like, obviously perfume is just complete, like, if you like the smell, whatever, but if Brad Pitt's in the thing, or if, or if what's her name, Charlize Theron is in the ad, or if someone else is in the ad, like at least you're like, it's just an attractive person. That's all they're doing. But this was more than that. Then a lot of the things that happen on social media for like false advertising, more than that. It's saying that there is something there that isn't there, and I think that that's pretty easy to understand from my perspective. This is a huge moral line that's been crossed. That's completely unethical. But I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, they'd like that documentary, the Netflix one, would like you to say basically like this just was a failure, just a failure, and
which is what Billy McFarland.
Yeah, it's just like a startup company that didn't work. Mm-hmm. But then let's talk about the Hulu documentary, because it's different, and the name is different. FYRE, fraud. You know? Yeah, and I think it's just different than The Greatest Party That Never Happened. So what do you think about, why does the Hulu documentary, do you feel like, exists versus maybe the Netflix documentary?
Well, they both cover, they kind of cover different elements of it, and they have a different, the Hulu one I definitely detected much more of a dive into the fraud of it and kind of the laughing at millennials element of it, kind of laughing at basically they're stupid for having been a victim of this, for buying these obnoxious tickets, and this is like funny because it's the worst impulses of the social media obsessed sector of millennials like getting screwed over. So I felt a little bit more of that, kind of making this FYRE fraud story an like critique of a millennial critique in a way. I felt more, and digging into the fraud more. And the Netflix one that people credit is it dove into that specific woman, Caribbean woman, who worked on the island, who was a victim, which I should say, because we've talked about how they're not a very sympathetic victim, the people who actually bought tickets to go to this music festival, but it is worth noting, and I think it's the Netflix one that does it, goes over this one woman who ran a catering company, and these are the true victims of it, is they recruited all this help of local Caribbean workforce. Yeah. They're getting hundreds of guys, including this woman who runs a catering company and was serving food to, I think, hundreds or many thousands and thousands of dollars, and she was putting up the money herself, feeling like, oh, well, this is going to pay off, this is a huge event I'm servicing. Yeah. So she ate a lot of the cost herself and was left completely in debt after doing working under the gun all hours of the day and night for weeks on end to make this shit happen, and then it doesn't happen, and she ended up in the hole by hundreds of thousands of dollars. She's since been, they did a GoFundMe and has been like given, they raised a bunch of money for her, luckily. Which is probably how the Netflix one feels better about itself, but probably. Just an interesting distinction to note.
Both of them are slick.
The real victims.
Both of them are well done, and we should talk about the part of the Hulu documentary that people have objected to, which is the fact that the main guy, this Billy McFarland, does not give an interview in the Netflix one, and the reason is because this guy wanted money. They didn't want to pay him, so that's a reason. And the Hulu one, although I think it tells a story that I find more to be the credible story, did pay him, and that was a lot of people found that objectionable, to pay the guy who's at the center of this fraud for the interview. And I did find though that having him there was interesting, and I also found that. Fraud is the right word. Fraud is the word that feels right to me, and fraud was that lens of the whole thing makes much more sense to me and draws a distinction that I don't think is the easy cop-out. I think that we do have this debate over whether or not fake it till you make it, when it doesn't work out, is simply a failure or a fraud. Because you are openly admitting at the beginning that you're faking it until you make it. And I think we've talked about this with the Theranos documentary too. There's this idea that fake it till you make it is a good idea. And when you're talking about confidence, it is a good idea. Like, if you don't feel confident or if you don't feel happy, sometimes you just put the smile on anyway or whatever.
Totally.
And that can actually have a positive impact. But beyond the pure self-esteem and confidence version of the world, when you're talking about actual things like numbers, investors, vendors like this woman that you were describing, customers, I don't have much sympathy for it. And I think that this guy, the portrait that's painted of him in the Hulu one, even though they did pay him for the interview, is much more of like, he was committing frauds before this, he's committed frauds in this, and he's committed frauds after this. And when you see it through that lens, it allows you to see the world better. You see that there are certain bad actors, and a bad actor, at least that's the opinion or the impression of him that I got through this. But when you see the bad actors, it makes it more make sense, and it also just, I don't think the excuse of like, I just wanted it to work but then it failed, is one that I really believe, because I think that it's pretending that you didn't have as much agency as you really had. When you decided to do the advertising contract, did you check and see if like you're advertising a real product or not a real product? And do you have any sort of moral responsibility to, or moral or legal or whatever responsibility to actually investigate whether or not what you're saying is perpetrating a fraud or whether it's not, and I don't think you should be able to say like, it's not my job to figure it out if I'm perpetrating a fraud or just doing something cool and creative. Like, I think it is, if we're going to have a society that's fair, and also we can all, because the main reason I think people forget, the main reason to not want fraud is not because we don't want people to do things that are kind of crazy and edgy and interesting. It's because when you have a market that people can trust, then more things are done. When people trust in the market, more people invest. Fraud actually undermines the ability for normal people to feel comfortable investing, and for comfortable people, or for people to be comfortable becoming entrepreneurs, in that they believe that the marketplace is ultimately fair and ultimately has rules. And that's why fraud is a big problem, and why it's important just to say like, oh, this shouldn't have happened. It's not just people coming after the fact going, oh, you fucked up and I want to be hard on you. It's that they undermined the trust in the market, and the trust in the market is what allows something like the American markets, the American entrepreneurial scene, to be thriving, because people do have a lot of trust that there isn't as much fraud. And when you have certain other markets, like let's say a cryptocurrency market or whatever, the reason that people care so much about fraud, and the reason that is because once fraud exceeds a certain percentage of the market, a lot of people are like, you can't even tell where the legit people are anymore, because there's so much fraud that you're like, I honestly, like, anything I touch is fucked up. So yeah, that's the reason to care about a lot of this, and care about the nature of entrepreneurs, and to pretend less like people just fall into their little frauds, and instead actually like there are clear choices you could make over whether or not your fake it till you make it story is about personal confidence, or whether or not it's about, I'm going to fake the product, I'm going to fake the numbers, I'm going to fake the promise that I make to the person and hope I can deliver. I'm not. I don't think that's I think that's the more of the moral lesson of maybe the Hulu documentary.
Totally. And I mean, it brings me to, ultimately what was the most impactful part of the documentary. And it stuck with me so much. This is at a point in the documentary where we've already seen the fraud that's been perpetrated. Billy McFarland, the CEO kind of behind all of it, has been caught. He's going to go to prison. He's been sentenced. The crime was committed. And he's talking in the interview, and he goes, well, V1 of this has failed. And just to use that kind of techie startup term, V1 of this has failed. It's like, he's talking about a crime. He's talking about a fraud that was perpetrated, and the fact that he lied to a bunch of people and sold tickets and let people show up to an island thinking they were getting products and services that didn't exist, and defrauding a bunch of people. The fact that he said V1, V1 was so indicative of what you're talking about, how Jerry Media probably thinks of it themselves. and how Billy McFarland definitely rationalizes it in his brain, which is like, this isn't a crime. This is how the startup world works, I'll have you know. And this was just a failed, we took a big swing and it failed on this one, but another version of this could have worked. And it's so delusional to me personally. I mean, there is a huge difference, you know, fake it till you make it. Or this idea of selling an idea, getting investment before something's built is so different than selling customers a product or service that you cannot deliver. And so there are hard, really easy lines to draw that were crossed.
The Tigre, you're crying so much.
We've got a cat interruption again, Tigre, our mascot.
He's yelling at the door. Come over here. Okay.
Michael's cat gets very lonely if he's not the center of attention.
Okay, so I think that's really well stated, though, is that there is a huge difference between selling an idea that I hope I can make, and someone goes, "I'll bet on your idea," versus selling a product to a customer. I think that is such a easy line that people forget is so easy. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are like, I'll sell you a custom built piece of software, but I gotta custom build it afterwards. I'll sell you a custom made suit, but I gotta custom make it afterwards. Okay, I understand that not all products are made when they're sold. That makes total sense, but let's be real. Like, this was not that. They didn't have the things that they said they had. And so, anyway.
And the customers in this circumstance, for example, there are GoFundMes where people say, hey, this is what we're going to try to build, and they'll sell levels. Fund our movie, you'll get a ticket for this donation, you'll get a shirt for the shirt. And that's kind of, the social media version. It's like, we're going to GoFundMe something, it doesn't exist, and we'll sell products that after you fund us. But it's like, the customer understands what's going on in that circumstance. This was not this was not built to order, This was not a GoFundMe where, hey, you're betting on a big idea. This is people who are like, I'm purchasing or renting a villa and I'm getting tickets to a movie concert to a music concert that major artists are playing at and booked at. And I mean, it's a pretty, that defense, which is an interesting one, and I could hear people saying, it's just like, yes, that is what you could tell yourself if you're Billy McFarland, who is kind of a delusional fraudster that you see, especially in the Hulu one. Yeah,
and I think that, so for me, I think the most impactful part, or maybe just one that's coming out, I mean, obviously, the scenes, the whole watching of it is a good experience objectively, but because it's just, there's a lot of, it's very rich in its dark comedy element, and obvious, all the elements to it are there. But the kind of the after scenes where they talk about some of his other businesses, like like selling concert tickets that they don't currently hold. I mean, that to me was the thing where it's like, we're gonna sell you backstage Beyonce tickets, and they sell them. And then they gotta go get those tickets, and then maybe at the last minute they'll like buy them on StubHub or whatever. It's like, and then maybe they won't deliver it's like that is not business that I think that's a real problem. If everyone was to operate on business that way, we would not, like, no one could trust anything. If you just felt like everyone you were buying, you just feel like if you're buying, renting a villa, if you go to a hotel room, if you're renting a plane seat, that seat exists, and that's why people get so fucking crazy when it doesn't. They're like, that's not how business should be in the United States. So I think it's kind of important that we undercut maybe this alternative view of business that some people have, which is that we can sell you something that we don't have.
Yeah, I think it must vary industry to industry, but...
Hold on one second. Let me get this cat. You want to say hi, Tigre? What up, Tig? Come on, get off.
Tigre. Kitty is entering the picture frame for those listening. Yeah, so it just makes me think of, working in TV, right? Or movies, you can imagine. I don't know the startup world as much, but it's weird how they have this conception of, that's how it works. You kind of sell an idea and then you build it. It's like in producing, for example, it would not be okay to approach let's say a big name writer, and go, oh well, we actually have the rights to the next George R.R. Martin book. It's probably gonna be like a bestseller. We have the rights. Do you want to join? And then you're gonna secure the best writer in town because he believes that you're not a delusional liar. And then you go to Will Smith's agent, and you're like, hey, does he want to be attached? Because we have George R.R. Martin and fucking Aaron Sorkin attached. Like, would you like to? They would probably not work together, but what you get it. So you're trying to build a movie. You've attached the A-list talent. You've attached the best writer in town, and then at the very end, before we start to get a huge, and you've sold it to the studio somehow because you fudged the papers on it, and then it turns out you're getting sued because you don't actually have the rights to George R.R. Martin's secret next novel that he's coming out with, and it's like,
it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. And imagine if my excuse to Will Smith and Aaron Sorkin is like, well, I was selling the good idea, but it just V1 failed.
It was a failure of delivery. It was a failure of
It was a failure of delivery. It'd be like you'd be immediately cast out as like the most slimy liar in town because that's like the whole thing is based on trust. I don't get the startup world, but I imagine when you approach investors, when you approach talent like Ja Rule, and you approach a marketing firm and you're starting to get the pieces together, it matters whether you're telling the truth on every piece. You can't have something like logistics and the contracts with talent be something that's not set in stone. And you can build this amazing team and do a marketing campaign, but to act like that's even the fact that they think they're even talented is what's so ridiculous, because you can imagine how easy producing anything would be if you would just be able to lie about one important factor and start assembling the pieces after that. Yeah,
it's just not. I mean, from a pure marketing perspective, I mean, it could have, if there was any reality to it, it could have been like a huge thing, like a huge music festival. I mean, Coachella exists, Yacht Week exists, like not for a single people, but like people do that shit, and so these things exist, but this is just fraud. It's just taking advantage of the things that people would go for. There's certainly a market, but they just defrauded people. It's like, it seems very obvious to me. So welcome back to Dirk Island. This segment is worth watching, and we're talking about both Fyre Festival documentaries, Netflix's FYRE, The Greatest Party That Never Happened, and Hulu's FYRE Fraud. And we're trying to answer, and by the way, the reason I have glasses on is because I've got a swollen eye, but...
and I'm wearing them in solidarity.
Yeah, so anyway, apologies for that, and we also thought it was a bit fitting for this ridiculous fake beach documentary extravaganza. But anyway, I'll just come out with it. My two thoughts on both of them are I liked one better than the other, and the first one that I'm going to say is the Netflix one. Now, I know it's slick and it's well produced, and I don't want to say it's otherwise, but this scale is not about whether it's slick or well produced. It's about whether or not it's worth your time to watch. And my answer for the Netflix one is, it is maybe worth watching. Now, I say maybe because I just think that although it is slick and it's a funny little story and whatever, like, you could do a lot better with your time. And I think there is a part that bothers me a bit more about the Netflix one, which is the fact that it's co-produced with Jerry Media, and it kind of makes them look good. And because they're
involved in the fraud itself,
involved in basically running a very effective marketing campaign for this FYRE Festival, which it didn't exist, and the marketing campaign, all the shots they do is of an island and of models and all the stuff that just didn't exist and never existed. They tried to make it exist, but it didn't exist at the time they did it, and I find that to be a bit it leaves me with a bit of a poor taste in my mouth, and why I downgrade it from maybe its entertainment value to more of like it's maybe worth watching. If you're interested in these kind of like weird fraud documentaries, kind of screwball documentaries, certainly a lot of interesting details, factoids, interviews in this. One story about a guy who says he's willing to try to make it work, willing to like give some public official a blowjob, which who knows if that's even true. But there are some interesting tidbits. But ultimately, I think that this documentary is a bit of it gives you a bit of a propaganda piece for this marketing campaign that was run, which I find to be a bit distasteful in retrospect and not quite the right perspective. And I actually feel like my perspective was enhanced by watching the Hulu documentary, where someone who did formerly work for that marketing company then gives an outsider's critique on whether or not the company was actively involved in perpetrating something they shouldn't have been doing, like suppressing social media comments that were negative and all this kind of stuff, which I feel like, so the Hulu documentary reflects back on the Netflix documentary and makes me view it as less worth watching realistically. So
yeah, I should say, Jerry Media wasn't involved in the fraud. They just worked with Billy McFarland, the fraudster himself.
Yeah.
But yes, they were. It certainly wasn't totally clean from an ethical perspective. They helped suppress some of the complaints and comments. They helped facilitate, or at least didn't intervene in people actually showing up to the island. So. But I will say I enjoyed watching it. Pure entertainment value. I really liked it. It's just like, you don't have to stop what you're doing and watch this if you're not particularly interested.
Okay, yeah, so worth watching. Hulu's Fire Fraud documentary, I would give it a slightly better review. Probably worth watching. Now, this is really for, if you watch a lot of documentaries, I would say it's probably worth your time for sure. I liked it. I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was ultimately a bit better than the other one, just because I think the fraud is the most interesting part. Seeing it as fraud, as opposed to seeing it as a failed party, like the greatest party that never happened, is a lens that made more sense to me, a lens that was more appealing. And it was also a very slickly produced documentary about a very compelling subject matter. The difference, though, I think, is that the reason this maybe isn't an 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever is because, like, not everyone, if you don't watch this movie, like, it's not going to change your life one iota. You know, it's not a foundational piece that's going to change your worldview, whatever. The other thing that kind of takes it a little bit down is the idea that they really did have to pay this guy to be in the film, which I agree is a bit conflicting. I ultimately think it made the film better to get him involved. This is the main character who perpetrated the fraud. He demanded to be paid, so I think it did ultimately enhance the film, but that's maybe why I do feel like both of them come out a bit morally conflicted, ultimately.
I totally agree. I don't think either one of them is completely clean from a moral perspective. But I will say, they were, for me, being interested, having the time and interest enough, it was fun to watch both in conjunction and draw the comparisons. It's not like you need to pick one. You could watch two, from my perspective. But the Hulu one just adds a little bit more of a critique. But yet again, even though it's a good critique of a section of millennials, I think people are becoming savvy that millennials aren't one thing, and just because
they don't all wear sunglasses.
Yeah, they don't all wear sunglasses inside, and they're not all Coachella heads chilling and living their best life. But it's a funny critique, but it's not relevant to society at large or the entire millennial generation.
Agreed, completely. And that's the story that gets revealed over more and more of these that you see. You know, it's very interesting to see these Instagram-focused documentaries, but and they all reveal a different element of society, but it is certainly the most parodied version, but not fulsome for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for watching. If you'd like to continue to follow with us, please subscribe on YouTube, and this is also available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts. Thanks again.
Thanks.